Good evening. I'm Sarah Watson, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's show, More Than Just the Almanac, Abraham Lincoln and the Duff Armstrong Murder Case. The Almanac trial is probably Abraham Lincoln's most famous case, immortalized by young Mr. Lincoln in 1939, starring Henry Fonda. The movie portrays a prosecution witness who saw the killing under the bright light of the moon. During the trial, Lincoln earned an acquittal for his client when he used the Farmer's Almanac to show the moon was not up at that time of the murder. Did Hollywood get it right? Joining us to shed light on the issue are John Lupton and Samuel Wheeler. John's the executive director of the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, and Sam is the director of history programs for the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission. For more information about our Looking for Lincoln conversations, you can visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. It's now my pleasure to introduce John and Sam.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's great to be back. We love doing programs for Looking for Lincoln. Heather and Sarah do such a great job, and it's a real treat to be back tonight. Now, we are here to talk about Abraham Lincoln's most famous legal case in his career. It's very fitting that we start out with the most iconic image related to Abraham Lincoln as a lawyer. Fittingly enough, this was an image taken in Beardstown right after the trial, Abraham Lincoln's iconic white suit. It's great to see so many folks tuned in from all over the country online, including my 10-year-old son, Owen. So I want to say hi to him at the outset. For those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with this case, we'll start out with just a quick thumbnail sketch. On May 7th, 1858, in Beardstown, Illinois, you can still visit the courtroom today here in the Heritage area. There was a one-day murder trial. William Duff Armstrong was on trial for murdering a man named James Metzger in what amounted to a bar fight that was outside. Duff's mother, Hannah Armstrong, convinced Lincoln to participate in the trial and help defend her son. Lincoln had a long history with the Armstrong family that dated back to New Salem. He's repaying a debt that he owes to Hannah and her late husband, Jack Armstrong, of the famous wrestling match that Lincoln had in New Salem. During the trial, the state's star witness said that he saw Duff Armstrong strike Metzger with a slingshot, with a weapon. And on cross-examination, Lincoln got the witness to repeat what he saw several times, that at about 11 o'clock at night outside, he sees Duff Armstrong strike Metzger with a weapon, a slingshot. Lincoln says, "How far away were you standing when you saw this?" He says he was standing about 90 feet away. What time in the night was it? Well, it was about 11 o'clock at night. So 11 o'clock at night, about 90 feet away, it was dark, you're outside. How were you able to see? How were you able to make sure that Duff used this foreign object to strike his opponent? And the witness says, well, there was a bright moon overhead, about where the sun would be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it illuminated the scene. It was very easy for me to see this. And Lincoln got this witness to repeat that several more times. Where were you standing? What time was it? And he got that witness to commit to the bright moon overhead. Now, at some point in the trial, Abraham Lincoln consulted an almanac and was able to show that the moon was not directly overhead as it would be at 1 o'clock as the sun would be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but the moon was actually setting, so it was dark. The star witness couldn't possibly have seen what he claimed, and Lincoln earned an acquittal for his client. Duff was found not guilty. Lincoln famously refused to accept any payment for his acquittal that he earned for Duff Armstrong. The Almanac case has become probably the most famous case in Abraham Lincoln's legal career. And there's a few pieces of evidence for that. It's one of the earliest cases that gets mentioned during Abraham Lincoln's lifetime. the day after Lincoln earned the nomination for run for president on the Republican for the Republican Party, a story appears in the newspaper in 1860 in Cleveland. It's picked up around the country, in which they talk about this new Republican candidate, and they publicize his performance 2 years earlier in the Almanac trial. Now, partisan politics in 1860 wasn't a whole lot different than today. The Democrat newspaper and other newspapers around the country began circulating a story about the famous Almanac trial and Lincoln's participation in it. And they argued Abraham Lincoln is not the most virtuous lawyer you've ever heard of, right? He actually was a trickster. And they circulate a story that we think is pretty false today, where they say that he used a fake almanac to show that the moon wasn't directly overhead. So this is a dirty partisan trick. So both Republicans and Democrats during Lincoln's lifetime used the Almanac trial for partisan purposes. In 1887, the story appears in a novel called The Graysons, a story of Abraham Lincoln that is a largely fictionalized account of an Illinois family, and Abraham Lincoln plays a role in it. But for our purposes, why that novel is important, why we bring it up, the Almanac trial appears in that novel, but it's a highly fictionalized account. The names are changed. The trial doesn't appear in 1858 towards the end of Lincoln's legal career. It begins in this novel in the beginning of Lincoln's legal career. It's his first murder trial. And famously, when Lincoln confronts the state's star witness and with the Almanac, he gets the eyewitness to crack. And in this fictionalized account, the eyewitness confesses to doing the murder himself. Now, John, you know a lot more about old movies than I do. Has Hollywood tackled the Almanac trial?
Hollywood, thanks, Sam. Hollywood has tackled the Almanac trial with the famous young Mr. Lincoln that Sarah mentioned, and we're talking about now. It's the famous John Ford movie where, you know, Henry Fonda portrayed young Mr. Lincoln, and the trial, the Duff Armstrong trial, kind of takes center stage in that entire movie. And so the same thing happens in the Graysons, where, you know, Lincoln is doing a cross exam of the star witness, and then the star witness breaks down and says, "Yes, I killed him. It was me." You know, there's some kernels of truth in this movie, but, you know, yes, it's largely a fictionalized account, which, you know, is what Hollywood is well known for. But, you know, really, it's a great Hollywood story because you've got a murder trial, which is interesting. You've got a moral debt to a friend, you know, with the Armstrongs, and Lincoln is using scientific evidence in an almanac to basically prove the star witness was wrong in his testimony. So it's got all the elements for drama, and you know, so that's why it's actually a good movie. I enjoy watching it. You know, I know it's fictional, largely fictional, but it's not a bad movie.
And so Hollywood has tackled the Almanac trial. It appears in so many biographies out there. Did an almanac alone lead to the acquittal of Duff Armstrong? That's really what John and I want to tackle tonight. We think the Almanac trial, though it's the most well-known case in Lincoln's legal career, there's a lot that folks have gotten wrong about it. So tonight we want to try to reconstruct a plausible scenario using primary documents, how we think the Almanac trial probably went down. We have, I guess we should talk first off about what are the resources, John, that we don't have, that we really wish we did have at our disposal tonight.
Well, what would be spectacular is if we had an actual trial transcript. So having the actual testimony of the attorneys and the witnesses. But those are few and far between in Lincoln cases. There's only about 4 cases in which we have a trial transcript of the 5,100 that we know of. So, but what we do have are the original documents from the case file, which tell us quite a bit. We also have reminiscences, which tell us quite a bit. There's a lot of competing reminiscences. So, I mean, we kind of have to weigh each one. And then those have been culled into, there's 2 books out there on Lincoln's Almanac trial. Excuse me. One of them is called, Abraham Lincoln's most famous case, as we're talking about, and the other is Moonlight. So those are two kind of very different books that tackle this case.
And the great resource that everybody has at their disposal, if you have an internet connection, you can go to the lawpracticeofabrahamlincoln.org. It is a wonderful collection of primary documents related to every legal case that Abraham Lincoln tried during his 25-year-long career. There's primary documents for more than 5,000 legal cases Lincoln was involved with, as well as all of his murder cases, including the Almanac trial. And so,
and actually, before just one other thing too, not only the Law Practice of Abraham Lincoln, but in our 4-volume book edition that we did on Papers Abraham Lincoln, Legal Documents and Cases, we featured the Almanac trial in there. So we have transcribed documents in the book edition as well.
So the story tonight starts at a camp revival that's taking place in the open air. It's a event that is going to take place, if you look at a map, just southwest of Mason City, Illinois. Open air camp revival. It's a place to hear the great preachers of the day in central Illinois, including the great Reverend Peter Cartwright, the traveling Methodist preacher. It's going to be a 10-day open revival, open air revival, where we're going to try to save your soul. Folks who are interested in evangelical religion will turn out. Folks that maybe aren't necessarily interested in getting their soul saved. They're just interested in the happening that's out there. They're going to be drawn to the folks. And about a mile away from the preacher's stand, there's what they call a whiskey camp. That is a place where they're going to set up several bars. There's going to be some concessions. We're told there's gambling, there's horse racing that's going to take place all day. And sure enough, we're told the first day at the revival goes pretty good, but the whiskey camp, some trouble happens at around dark. Right, John?
Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot of alcohol being consumed, and that's actually by statute. They can't sell alcohol within a mile of the camp, of any camp that's, in Illinois. But people start drinking a lot. And, what happens when you start drinking a lot? You get a little mouthy with each other sometimes. And Armstrong, was kind of done for the night. He'd done his drinking. He just kind of curled up somewhere. And then Metzger started to poke him a little bit, literally and figuratively. And so the two of them ended up getting into a big fight. And during this fight, Armstrong just really clocks him a good one, right in the right side of his head. And he's got a big shiner. So they start wrestling a little bit more. And then when Metzger was starting to get the best of him, some people came in, pulled him off. And then so they kind of actually shook hands and made up like, hey, everything's cool between us now. So Metzger goes off. And he must have had some altercation with James Norris at some point during the night, too, because Norris was behind a tree or something like that. And he had a yoke. What's that called? There it is. A neck yoke, and clocked him on the back of the head with that, knocked him out. So Metzger ends up, getting on his horse. He might have fallen off his horse a couple times. Goes back home, and he dies 3 days later.
So we have Metzger arrives home. He dies 3 days later. His wife alerts the authorities, and they have a coroner's inquest. They want to determine the cause of death for Metzger, try to reconstruct the circumstances surrounding his death. The coroner's inquest ultimately concludes that Metzger has died as a result of homicide. They've found that he was in 2 altercations that night. They've brought in a doctor from Petersburg that has conducted an examination of his body, and they find that he has a terrible wound on the right side of his head above his right eye. And he also has another wound in the back of his head. And through some eyewitnesses, The authorities learn about this fist fight that he had with Duff Armstrong, and they also learn about this blow that he's received from James Norris. And what unfolds next, John?
Well, at this point, after the coroner determines that it's, he was killed by homicide or blunt force trauma to his skull, then the sheriff goes out and arrests Norris and Armstrong and charges them with the murder of poor Metzger. So now we get into the trial phase. So a grand jury is called and they examine all the evidence that shows, yes, these two people were responsible for Metzger's death. So the indictment is taking place there in the Mason County Circuit Court. And then it's at this point is Norris wants to go to trial. Well, actually, wait a second. We need to get into the who the people are here. Yeah, so we got that. You got that up. Thank you, Sam. So yeah, Hugh Fullerton is the state's attorney. So he's the one who prepares the indictment. And Norris did not have any money to pay for counsel. So the court appointed William Walker to represent him. He didn't get paid for this, but it was you in a criminal case like this, you had to have representation. So Walker represented him. Now the Armstrongs were able to, or Hannah Armstrong was able to scrape together enough money to hire an attorney for Duff Armstrong. So a young man by the name of Caleb Dilworth from Mason County represented Armstrong. And at this point is when we start, there's a separation in the case. So Armstrong wants a change of venue. Norris wants to go straight to trial because Norris was, he had a wife, he had kids. He wanted to get this trial kind of over with as quickly as possible. So the case separates at this point. So Norris's case stays in the Mason County Circuit Court. A number of witnesses come in on both sides. A jury finds him guilty of manslaughter, which is the lesser charge. So he wasn't found guilty of the murder, but he was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years in the penitentiary.
So I think a couple of points are important to underline in that initial case, People versus Norris, that takes place in Mason County in November of 1857. He believes he's innocent. He says that it's unclear if he even admits that there was an altercation between he and Metzger. At the trial, there is a star witness. Charles Allen comes forward, and he is the only person that testifies that he saw Norris waylay Metzger as he was hiding behind a tree. As Metzger walks by after he had an altercation with Armstrong, he sees Norris strike a blow with this 3-foot-long piece of wood into Metzger's back of his head. As John said, Armstrong's attorney, Dilworth, perhaps rightly so, requested a change of venue. Everybody knows these guys. They have heard about this altercation that took place at the open air camp. It's going to be hard to seat a jury. And the judge takes that request under advisement. And Norris, sitting in jail, is married with 3 or 4 children at the time. He's very eager to go to trial. His defense attorney, court appointed, I believe probably advised him correctly that we probably should have a change of venue, get us out of this county and get a clean slate. We find out afterwards that Norris, this isn't his first time that he's had a brush with the law. About a year earlier, he had faced a very similar incident where he was up on murder charges again, and he was cleared. He was acquitted in that trial. There are some folks in that community afterwards that say some people thought he should have been found guilty during that trial. And so in this trial, they found a way to get him convicted and of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The same day that he is found guilty of that lesser charge, the judge does grant Duff Armstrong a change of venue, and it's moved to nearby Cass County Circuit Court. His justice moves very quickly in Antebellum, Illinois. Within 2 months of the death of Metzger, Norris was found guilty, and Armstrong's case was probably set to go to trial. It's sort of a snafu that the court has in November of 57. They're not, the court record hasn't been transferred from Mason County to Cass County. And so the People versus Armstrong doesn't go to trial in the fall of 57. Caleb Dilworth actually leaves town. That's Armstrong's lawyer. He leaves town when he realizes that the case is going to be called at that term. And sort of a couple days later, the state's attorney realizes he hasn't formally asked the court for a continuance to the next term. And so they hastily get together a hearing in which the state's attorney will formally request that this case be continued to the next term of court. Duff Armstrong is brought into the court. This is a capital murder case. And at this moment, Duff doesn't have legal representation. His lawyer has left town. And this is the moment that Abraham Lincoln enters into this case. How do you interpret that, John? Do you think that at this moment in November of 57, Hannah has gotten to Lincoln and convinced him to help defend her son? Or do you think that this is a more happenstance instance of Lincoln being at the right place at the right time to help out Duff?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And, we don't exactly know the answer of how Lincoln got involved. There are some reports that Hannah Armstrong wrote Lincoln wanting him to get involved right after this happened in August. But we don't know if that's the case. We also have heard that Hannah Armstrong actually made a trip to Springfield to enlist Lincoln. Those probably didn't happen, would be my guess. But Lincoln happened to be in Cass County in November of 1857 for a couple of cases. He was involved in a major railroad case that was going on there. And he was also involved in a divorce case. So the railroad case wrapped up, and Lincoln just, happened to stay in court, and the divorce case was continued to the next term. But while the Armstrong case was going on, that's when Lincoln saw, hey, Dilworth left. He doesn't have any representation. So I'm going to step up and just, yes, let's continue this case to the next term. But at the same time, Lincoln also requested bail for Armstrong. And this kind of confuses me a little bit because murder was not a bailable offense, or, you couldn't get bail from a murder case. So, but you could, like in very rare exceptions. So Lincoln was probably arguing for, one of these rare exceptions, but the judge quickly said no, no bail. So basically Armstrong is going to remain in jail for the next 6 months until the May term of 1858, when the Cass County Circuit Court is in session next. So we know Lincoln was involved in November of 1857. We don't know how, though. We don't know whether it was by Hannah Armstrong's solicitation or just he happened to be there. Probably the latter would be my guess if you were to, force me to make an answer.
So it's a debatable point within the historiography. We fast forward to May of 1858. We think Abraham Lincoln is not yet officially part of Duff Armstrong's defense team.
Correct.
In May of 1858, the spring term of circuit court begins in Cass County. Everybody expects the first day of the circuit court that People versus Armstrong will be called. It's a fluke that it's not called because the state's star witness, Charles Allen, doesn't show up. There's a great story behind the scenes taking place. Remember, he's the eyewitness that puts a weapon into Duff Armstrong's hand to strike what the state is going to argue is a fatal blow on Metzger. He doesn't show up for the first day of court. They can't find him. Come to find out, we think, Allen is friendly with the Armstrongs, even though he's told investigators and authorities that he saw Duff strike this fatal blow with a weapon. He's friendly with the Armstrongs. He doesn't want his testimony to result in the hanging of Duff Armstrong. And so evidence seems to indicate that the Armstrongs have secreted Charles Allen away, and they're hiding him out close by. So this case isn't called yet. On May 6th, 1858, Abraham Lincoln arrives in Beardstown. Again, we don't think it's specifically to be involved in People versus Armstrong. He has other business at the Beardstown court. He's involved in another case. As he's leaving the office of another lawyer that he's sort of talking about this other case that he's involved with, we think this is the moment, May 6th, 1858, in which Hannah Armstrong grabs Lincoln and pleads with him to help defend her son. Lincoln spends the rest of the day working with the defense team. He's learning the facts of the case. He's tells the Armstrongs, you got to go find the state's eyewitness. We'll deal with what he thinks he saw that night about this weapon. But remember that Charles Allen was also the state's star witness in that earlier trial, People versus James Norris, in which Norris was convicted of manslaughter. The defense explains to the Armstrongs, we need his testimony. We need to argue in court that that was the fatal blow that killed Metzger and not anything that Duff Armstrong did. And really quick, the next day, the trial begins. We think Lincoln goes into that day of the trial believing his role is going to be to just help out Caleb Dilworth, who is the lead attorney for Duff Armstrong. Lincoln is going to observe the trial. Lincoln is going to take notes. Lincoln is going to pass notes and suggestions over to Dilworth. And when there's opportunity, Lincoln may cross-examine a witness and try to plant seeds of reasonable doubt into the jurors' minds that will lead to an acquittal of Duff Armstrong. And we think probably going into that day, Lincoln knows he's going to deliver the closing argument for Armstrong. Lincoln, by 1858, is a senior member of the bar. He's a seasoned attorney. He's a great politician. He knows how to give a persuasive speech, which is so critical in a jury trial like this. How does the prosecution's case go, John?
Well, obviously, Allen, again, is the star witness because he's the one who saw Armstrong hit Metzger with the slung shot. So he's going to testify to that. And he was able to see what happened, as we've been saying, because he said that the moon was high in the sky, as it would be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So that was the star witness. We also had a lot of other witnesses who saw the fight, witnesses, doctor's testimony. So basically, it was kind of the same witnesses that convicted James Norris 6 months earlier. So that's kind of the prosecution's main argument, is just to show that Armstrong had the weapon, he hit him, this punch contributed to his death, and he should be found guilty.
And so putting a weapon in Duff Armstrong's hands is critical to the state's argument, because to get a murder conviction, you have to show malice of forethought, as it says in the statute. Putting a weapon in Duff Armstrong's hand before the fight, he has a weapon, he's premeditating what he's going to do to this fellow, and that's how you get a murder conviction. Now, when it's time for the defense to present their case, they're going to try to dismantle that argument of malice of forethought. They present several witnesses saying there was no weapon. It was just a fist fight. It was a fair fight. It was actually Duff Armstrong defending himself against a bigger, intoxicated bully of a person, right? Lincoln had done, we think, a pretty good job during cross-examination of Charles Allen. He locked him into that story that he saw Duff Armstrong use this weapon by the light of the moon. We think during the defense, when they presented their case, one of the key witnesses is a fellow named Nelson Watkins. Nelson Watkins comes forward and he says, I am positive that Duff Armstrong never used a weapon. He never used a slung shot during this fist fight. He says, I was at the whiskey camp. I was right next to the location of the fist fight. He was sleeping underneath his wagon at the time. The fight woke him up. He watched the fight take place. How does he know that Duff never used the slung shot? Watkins says, because the slung shot was mine. I'm the one that brought it to the whiskey camp. When I went to sleep underneath my wagon, I took it out of my pocket. I put it underneath the wagon while I slept. The next morning, when I woke up, I drove the wagon off and I forgot to put the slingshot back in my pocket. As I was driving off, he dropped the slingshot at the scene of the fight, and he reasons somebody picked it up and put two and two together that Duff must have used this during that fist fight to inflict such a blow to Metzger.
Which is what Charles Allen said, that he saw him with the slingshot. He saw Armstrong with the slingshot.
Yes.
So you've got kind of differing testimony here.
Yeah, different testimony. And so we're trying to erase that malice of forethought. The other key point in the defense case is they present another expert medical opinion. Remember, during the coroner's inquest, during the Norris trial, they used a doctor from Petersburg, and he talked about that horrible wound that Metzger had in the front of his skull, and that was inflicted, as it would reasonably, that you might argue, from the punch that Armstrong inflicted on Metzger. Lincoln and the defense team, they use another medical doctor. This time, this fellow comes from Beardstown. And remember, because of our change of venue, our jury pool was selected from the Beardstown area. And now they put the Beardstown physician on the stand, somebody that those members of the jury probably trust quite a bit. He offers another theory. He says there were two wounds to Metzger, one in the front, one in the back. He says it's not out of the realm of possibility that the wound inflicted on the back of Metzger's skull actually created that wound in the front of his skull, created that fracture. The doctor says, I've actually treated 3 people who died of such wounds. And during his testimony, he even has a prop, a human skull, where he's showing the physics of how a wound to the back of the skull can create a fracture in the front. We're planting the seeds of reasonable doubt in the jury's mind. And so now it comes time for the closing argument. By all accounts, John, Lincoln does a phenomenal job summing up the defense's case.
Right. And kind of getting back to an earlier point about Charles Allen, the Hollywood version is that Lincoln confronted him with the Almanac during Lincoln's cross-examination of Allen. We tend to think that he did not do that during the cross-examination of Allen, that he brought out the Almanac during the closing arguments. But during these closing arguments, Lincoln, and again, Lincoln has been batting cleanup for years and years and years. He was always the person who did the final argument in a case because he was so really good at, summing up the case, even summing up the opposition argument, and then kind of tearing it down. So Lincoln's closing arguments were he summed up the case, but he also brought in this tugging at your heartstrings moment, where he goes into great detail about how when he was a floating piece of driftwood coming into New Salem, that the Armstrongs took him in. Hannah Armstrong sewed his jeans, sewed up the holes in his jeans. He even rocked baby Duff Armstrong, while he was living in New Salem. So Lincoln is crying as he's telling this story because it's such an important moment in his development. And everyone else in the courtroom starts crying also. So and this is what Lincoln was really good at, was being able to communicate with juries. So that was kind of the closing arguments, just showing his eloquence, but combining both logic and emotion in it. But it's during the closing arguments is when we think he brought out the Almanac, which makes a lot of sense, because if you bring up the Almanac during the cross-exam, then the prosecuting attorney has a chance to kind of rebut that evidence. But during closing arguments, there's really nothing to rebut. But the Almanac allegedly didn't have as great as impact as what Hollywood shows and what the Graysons showed. But it was basically just being used to discredit the one of the star witnesses.
So Lincoln's not done. After the closing argument today, juries receive sort of standardized instructions as they begin their deliberation, but the process works differently in the 19th century. The prosecution, as well as the defense, they have the opportunity to write out jury instructions. They give them to the judge. The judge signs off on, yes, we will allow the jury to look at these questions to guide their deliberation. The prosecution side, during their jury instructions, one of their instructions, they allow the jury to, if they don't believe that Duff Armstrong should be guilty of murder, if the state hasn't done a great job of approving this malice aforethought standard, then they allow the jury the possibility to find Duff guilty of manslaughter. That's sort of the gist of their jury instructions. John, you've written a lot about Lincoln's ability to craft these jury instructions. The Armstrong case is a great example of Lincoln's ability to craft jury instructions that are very favorable to his client.
Yeah, and these jury instructions that you see up on the screen, it doesn't mention anything about an almanac, surprisingly. What Lincoln is arguing here is that if they believe from the evidence that Norris killed Metzger, then they should acquit Armstrong because the guilty party has already been determined. So if Norris is guilty, then Armstrong must be innocent. And they're also, he's also putting in the reasonable doubt that Sam said about how the death blow came, whether it was on the eye or on the back of the head. But Lincoln is basically saying that, you need to find this beyond a reasonable doubt, that Armstrong and Norris acted together, and that, Norris struck one blow, Armstrong struck the other blow, but that they were working together to kill Metzger. And so again, with these jury instructions, what Lincoln is basically doing is just putting reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. And, to convict in a murder case, it's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt. So crafting, these plausible scenarios of other things that could happen kind of made a bigger impact on the jury than the almanac.
So the jury returns a verdict of not guilty. Abraham Lincoln famously tells Hannah and Duff he's not going to charge him anything. He's just repaying the debt of the kindness that the Armstrongs had given him as a young man in New Salem. This becomes an iconic moment in Lincoln historiography. Hollywood tells us that the Almanac made all the difference, that was the key moment in the trial. And a surprising number of Lincoln biographies, really good Lincoln biographies, oftentimes perpetuate that argument. I think what we're trying to argue tonight is that the Almanac was important, but maybe its significance has been a bit overdone. This case is about more than just an almanac, and so we would point to a couple key pieces that we very briefly touched on tonight. The testimony of Nelson Watkins. He says, Duff didn't have that slingshot. It was mine. I had it the whole time. Lincoln reportedly told the Armstrongs he's a key person in this trial. Dr. Charles Parker, he was the medical expert that they brought in that talked about that reasonable doubt, that it could have been that blow from the back that Norris had done. And by the way, he's already in the penitentiary, found guilty of manslaughter for inflicting this. The judge in the case later said he believed the expert medical testimony that the defense offered was the deciding factor in this case. Lincoln's closing argument that John did such a great job talking about, Lincoln, you appealed to the jurors' intellect as well as their heartstrings. The assistant prosecutor in the case, J. Henry Shaw, believed Lincoln's emotional speech was the thing that turned the case for the defense. And then what about Lincoln's written instructions? Caleb Dilworth, the lead defense attorney, he believed those were the key to victory that saved Duff's life. I don't know about you, John, but I think maybe as we reconsider the Almanac trial, maybe it's not one of these things. that led to an acquittal of Duff Armstrong, but maybe it's a collection of these things that helped plant the seeds of reasonable doubt that lead to Duff living a long, natural life and not finding his end at the hangman's noose, right?
Yeah, and really kind of the larger question here, not a larger question, but the larger takeaway from this is that, this was a circuit case. So again, Lincoln kind of has to think on his feet while he's, preparing for this case, but it's just a really great example of the Armstrong trial and even though Cass County wasn't on the circuit, but it's still kind of a circuit related case because Lincoln comes in kind of at the 11th hour, becomes an attorney, but it shows, it's just a model of how to analyze and present and argue a case before a jury. And so, this is what Lincoln's law practice is really about, is just showing, even though, the Duff Armstrong trial, it's a great example of the larger entirety of Lincoln's law practice, that he was a pretty shrewd attorney and, he knew what was going on in a courtroom. Did he make mistakes? Absolutely. He made a lot of mistakes in the courtroom. But for the most part, he was a really competent attorney, and he was sought after by a lot of different people. Other attorneys wanted Lincoln to help with cases. So, this is, again, just a really good example of showing Lincoln's competence as an attorney in antebellum Illinois.
John, there's a lot more that we would love to say about this case, but I think I am most interested in what folks out there want to know about this case. This is a very popular topic in the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage area. You can visit the courtroom. You can learn a lot more about this trial in Beardstown. But Heather, I'm interested in what folks want to know about this case, and maybe John and I can learn a thing or two.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everyone. Heather Fieser here, Program Manager for Looking for Lincoln. If you have not already typed a question in the chat, and I know several people have, please do so, and we will try to get through as many of them as time allows this evening. All right, so our first question, gentlemen, is, did Peter Cartwright play a role in finding out who injured Metzger?
It's a good question. You'll see it a lot in the historiography. You'll see it a lot in the newspaper articles from years after the fact. They try to connect Peter Cartwright with this. I don't see a lot of evidence for it. Peter Cartwright was the main speaker that day. He speaks the first 2 days of the open air revival, and then he leaves town. Remember, the fight takes place on the first night. The fellow doesn't die until 3 days later. Peter Cartwright's probably gone by the time the investigation really launches. By all accounts, I think there's plenty of eyewitnesses on the ground that are able to talk eloquently about the fist fight that took place with Duff Armstrong. And then there's one fellow, Charles Allen, who had eyesight that was just a little bit better than everybody else's, and he saw the fight take place between Norris and Metzger as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a couple questions that want to know what happened to James Norris. Did he stay in the penitentiary the whole 8 years? Like, what happened to this man?
So I did a deep dive into Norris as well, because I like the question, the person that asked that question, I was really interested in what happens to him. He didn't get the opportunity of having Abraham Lincoln defend him during his trial. And so he's found guilty of manslaughter. He is sent to the penitentiary in Alton. He later is transferred to Joliet when it opens. He was sentenced to 8 years. He spent about 5 years in the state penitentiary. William Walker, who we would call a public defender today, he didn't receive any money for defending Norris. His client was found guilty of manslaughter, but God bless William Walker, he never gave up on his client. He continued to fight for a pardon for Norris. Walker joined the Armstrong defense team. He saw the problems with the eyewitness, Charles Allen. He wrote up those problems, and he lobbied the governor of Illinois during the American Civil War to pardon Norris. Norris wrote a letter to the governor. There was circulated a petition where like everybody in the area seemed to sign their name to the petition, including members of the Armstrong family, saying that this guy is innocent. And after 5 years in the state penitentiary, Norris he received a pardon from the governor of Illinois, Governor Yates. Norris didn't have a great life afterwards. His wife ended up leaving him while he was in the penitentiary. She ended up remarrying another man. His children were actually raised by other families in the area. He comes out of prison. He finds his wife has remarried, but never acquired a divorce through the legal system. He actually goes through the process of getting a divorce from her. He lived into the 1880s and then he dropped out of sight. I can't find him in any other court records. So I wish he had a better ending to his story. And I wish he had the opportunity for his defense attorney, who I think cared a lot, to have more time to give him maybe a proper defense during his trial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the follow-up question, and now somebody else asked this, is what happened to Duff after the trial?
Well, obviously Duff was free. So he was able to walk out of the courtroom on his own, which was great. Duff Armstrong ended up volunteering for the Civil War. And we know he went to New York. Was that it? Actually, Sam probably knows more about this than Duff, because he's the one who did the deeper dive than me. But yeah, Armstrong with some of his brothers fought in the Civil War. But yeah, Sam, you want to?
Yeah, so Duff, I think he's thankful beyond belief that he escapes, this horrible trial. I mean, we lose sight that it's a capital murder case. When you're charged with the crime of murder in 19th century Illinois by statute, if you're found guilty, it is a capital offense. You will hang for your crime. I can't imagine what a stressful, horrible process that is, if indeed you know that you are an innocent person. And Duff believed he was an innocent person, I'm sure, during this trial. Immediately after the trial, he's thankful. He does end up enlisting in 1862 in the American Civil War, along with two of his brothers. One is wounded, one dies during the American Civil War. Hannah Armstrong has lost her husband right before the murder trial. She remarries, and she is close to her oldest son, Pleasant Armstrong's widow, as well as his child. She's lost a child in the Civil War, has another son who's wounded, and she lobbies the President of the United States. She sends a telegram to him that says, "Send my other boy home, send Duff home. I need him here." And Abraham Lincoln, he must have held Hannah Armstrong in very high esteem, because he wasted no time in notifying her that he tracked Duff down and he discharged him from the military. Duff goes back home. He ends up marrying his oldest brother's widow, and helps his mother out. And I see a fellow in your chat named Douglas Kirby, who knows a lot more about Duff Armstrong's background than we have time to talk about tonight. But Duff had a long natural life. The Civil War experience was a harrowing experience. There's stories floating around the area that he would show his discharge papers signed by Abraham Lincoln to folks in the area. He had quite a story to tell. He had more than just a brush with fame in the name of Abraham Lincoln.
Okay. All right. So here is our next question. So Lincoln had his photograph taken after the trial. And was there a connection? So was it just because he just wanted to have his picture taken right after this, or was convenient? Do you guys know the story?
John, tell me you know the story, because I don't know the story.
No, I really don't know the story. It's just that I think it just was happenstance. There was a young photographer in Beardstown, and Lincoln was obviously a rising star in the Republican Party. And remember, in May of 1858, this is 1 month before the House Divided speech. So, I mean, and this was at a time when, everyone pretty much knew that Lincoln was probably going to be the Republican nominee for the Senate. So this, young photographer in Beardstown thought, hey, Lincoln's in my town. I'm going to get a picture of him. And again, it's the picture that Sam showed at the very beginning of this. It's the iconic Lincoln the lawyer picture where he's in his white suit, obviously beardless. Yeah, and I think we were talking about this, but the original, I think, is at the University of Nebraska. Is that right, Sam?
Yeah, that's what I'm told. So, yeah, I mean, this is the era, remember, the context of all this. This is before TV and the internet and radio. Your chances for entertainment are very slim in Central Illinois in 1858. When court is in session, if you don't have pressing business, you're probably going to be milling around the courthouse. This is a murder trial. This is a capital murder trial. Abraham Lincoln is somewhat of a political rising star in 1858. When the acquittal comes down, there's cheering. Abraham Lincoln is a superstar that day, right? Probably along with Dilworth, as well as William Walker. Duff Armstrong probably is drinking for free that night in Beardstown. But we're told that Abraham Lincoln is whisked away to the young man's shop, gets his picture taken. And Lincoln also gives a lecture that night in the courthouse in Beardstown. It's his Discoveries Invention lecture, which if you've never heard of it, go read it right before you fall asleep tonight, because it's not really compelling.
It's not the Gettysburg Address.
It's not the Gettysburg Address, right? It's Abraham Lincoln as a lecturer. But we're told he gave it that night. The next morning, he goes out of town. But for that moment in time, and I always like to think about this, in 1858, during this murder trial, I don't think there's anybody in that courtroom thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to be the next president of the United States. I don't think that's the case. But remember, the next month after this murder trial happens, Lincoln secures the Republican nomination to run for the United States Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. His star is on the rise. 2 years later, he captures the nomination to run for president. He becomes president of the United States. He saves the Union. He ends slavery. He becomes a martyr to the Union. He becomes an icon. And the folks that witnessed that murder trial in Beardstown in 1858, they begin to look back on that trial and to talk about what they think they saw that day. And they begin telling a pretty amazing story. And it's sort of like that story of catching the big fish. It keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger each time you tell it, right? I was there that day at the murder trial. And I think that helps explain a little bit about how that legend came to grow.
Well, and on that note, and John, maybe you want to answer this question, but one of the questions is there evidence of the almanac being fake? And Sam briefly touched on that as a potential that probably wasn't true, but could you just touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah, that was a charge that, like Sam said, that came up, as early as 1860, and it kind of gained some steam. Ward Hill Lamon, in his 1872 biography, talks about it. And, he even says that, maybe it is fake. So there was evidence that, Lincoln might have taken the almanac to a nearby printer to change all of the threes, because he allegedly had an 1853 almanac, to change all the threes to sevens to make it look like it's genuine. But we don't have any evidence at all that actually happened. And in fact, I mean, if you think about it, the 1857 almanac, the actual one, shows exactly what Lincoln is arguing, is that the moon hadn't quite set, but it was just about to set or rise. I don't remember which one, actually. I think it was to set. But, remember, you're in a grove of trees. So just because the moon was still out, the light is going to be a little diffused differently coming through the trees. So the almanac is showing Lincoln's point. So there's really no reason why he would even want to use a fake almanac. So it doesn't make sense to me that a fake almanac would be used.
Yeah, I can understand. Okay, here is our next question, and it is about Hannah. So we talked about her comments, but we didn't really talk about how Lincoln knew Hannah. So could we go back and like give a little bit of the backstory of, I mean, Sam touched on the fact that he must have had a really high opinion of Hannah because of what he did. So could we talk a little bit about how Lincoln had a relationship with Hannah?
Yeah, so as far as I know, the relationship goes back to his time in New Salem. He comes into New Salem, in his own words, as a floating piece of driftwood. I love it, John, that you referenced that phrase that Lincoln used to describe himself when he comes to settle in New Salem. He's a nobody. He is ambitious. People see, potential in this young guy, Abraham Lincoln, and he's immediately tested by one of the young guys in the neighborhood near New Salem, Clary's Grove, Jack Armstrong. Jack Armstrong's part of a group of guys that are, by all accounts, pretty rough individuals, right? Hard drinking, pretty tough guys. And so they're going to test out this new young guy, Abraham Lincoln, who nobody knows. We're going to see if he's trustworthy, if he's up to snuff. And so they famously have a wrestling match where everybody believes that Jack is going to really trounce Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as the stories go, held his own in this wrestling match. And who knows if Jack won or if Abe won or if it was a draw or if Jack did a dirty trick or if Abraham at the end of this wrestling match challenged to fight anybody, everybody. But at the end of the day, at this wrestling match, everybody believed, wow, this young guy, Abraham Lincoln, he's a good dude. He is worthy of our respect. He's accepted into the community. Jack Armstrong helped make that happen. When Lincoln signs up for the Black Hawk War, Lincoln is elected captain, and Jack serves right by his side, right underneath him in that unit. When they come back, Lincoln famously tells us Hannah is married to Jack. Hannah helps stitch up the holes in Lincoln's pants. She really, they welcome a young Abe Lincoln into their home. They let him stay there for weeks at a time. They feed him. They mend his clothes. He takes care of the kids. He's kind of like Uncle Abe, to these kids in New Salem in the early days. And so he has very kind feelings for Jack and Hannah. A woman on the frontier, Hannah, she's got a bunch of kids. She's married to a guy like Jack Armstrong, which can't be easy, right? As we've described him. She's an absolute contemporary with Abraham Lincoln. I think they're the same age. Lincoln has a lot of respect for Hannah. And I think it shows that Hannah, when her son's in trouble, she either comes to Springfield or she has a letter written to Abraham, but she's trying to get help for her boy during the Civil War. She knows she can reach out to Lincoln and she gets that discharge for him. So, I think he held her in high esteem, and it all goes back to those early days in New Salem. And the people who heard Lincoln's closing argument, they say he was as eloquent about his relationship with the Armstrongs as they'd ever heard anybody talk. And as John said, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when Lincoln was done talking about that debt that he owed Hannah and Jack.
Okay, so we have two more questions. The first one, you've already talked about how you can go to the courthouse in Beardstown, but is there anything from Macon County? I think it's Macon County you mentioned.
Mason.
Yes, Mason County, sorry. That is left, like if somebody is like, there anything there that somebody could see if they wanted to go there to see where the actual murder took or non-murder took place?
Well, that's a really good question. So it's hard to pinpoint the site of where the revival took place, where the whiskey camp was actually located. It was in a rough area, Walker's Grove, which basically refers to an area on the map. There's conflicting stories about actually where on the map this was. There are locals in the area, and I'm sure they're in our chat today that can point you to where that spot was, where the murder took place. And I'm told that it's located just southwest of Mason City. I've never been there myself, but it's located today on private property. And if you know the right person, my gosh, you might get an invitation to go see it.
Okay, so as we end all of our presentations, here's my favorite question to ask. Why? And you both get to answer. So you both have to answer. None of you are off the hook. Why is it important that we still study the life of Abraham Lincoln in the 21st century?
Sam, you go first.
Well, I think it's important that we study the life of Abraham Lincoln in the 21st century because Abraham Lincoln is the most important president, the most significant president in American history. If history would have turned out differently from 1861 to 1865, you and I would be living in a much different America. It's as simple as that. And so going back and studying the context of how Abraham Lincoln became president and what he confronted with the challenge of the Civil War, just let the South go or fight for the maintenance of the Union. How important and how risky, how significant was it to not only continue the war until the Union was saved, including the end of American slavery? I think I would explain it as Lincoln is significant because without Lincoln's presidency, we are a much different nation than we are today.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Sam said, but yeah, I think just the death blow to slavery is why Lincoln is important to study today. And there's all sorts of different historiography about whether Lincoln freed the slaves or whether the slaves freed themselves. But Lincoln certainly gave the African Americans the opportunity to become free with the Emancipation Proclamation, and you can go on and on about what the Emancipation Proclamation actually did, but it also armed the African Americans, which gave them something to fight for, literally fight for, in securing their own freedom. So I think just that Lincoln preserved the Union that we have today is something that no president has ever been faced with before, and he accomplished it quite well. And he himself said that a task this is a task that had fallen on him. It was greater than even had fallen on Washington. So that's why Lincoln is important to continue to study today.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us tonight and having yet another wonderful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience did too. And I would like to say good evening to our audience, and we hope you have a good rest of your evening, and we hope you will join us next time. Bye.
Thank you, Heather.